I need a monitor for my camera, so I bought 3. Actually, I bought 5. In 2022, I started transitioning to shooting primarily handheld for my wedding films, and in 2023, I'm making the switch completely, which means I need a monitor so that I can hold the camera close to my body and still be able to see what I'm doing. I already own an Atomos Ninja V, but honestly, it's just kind of too heavy and bulky. I want something as slim and lightweight as possible. I don't want to be lugging around a bunch of extra weight that I don't really need. That's where these monitors come into play. After watching tons of YouTube videos, I've narrowed my search for the perfect lightweight monitor down to these 4. Kind of 5. The Portkeys PT6, the Desview R5 II, the Osee T5 Plus, and the Atomos Shinobi. Unfortunately, upon receiving the Desview, I very quickly realized it was not going to work for me. The whole thing felt very cheap and plasticky, it wasn't bright enough, and the screen quality was also kind of poor. Desaturated colors, a green color cast, and the contrast did not match my C70's LCD. So it's going back to Amazon. Which brings me to the main 3. My goal is to find the slimmest, lightest weight monitor that also very closely matches my C70's screen quality. That part is very important to me because I need to be able to trust the image I'm getting on the monitor so that I can make color and exposure adjustments without fear of ruining my shots. I need accurate colors, similar contrast to the C70's LCD screen, and good viewing angles so that I can tilt the monitor back and forth and still be able to see everything correctly. The Shinobi is undoubtedly the biggest monitor here. It's got a pretty decent sized bezel around the entire screen, and it's a relatively thick monitor. The Osee is just as thick as the Shinobi, but it doesn't have the big bezels and is noticeably shorter. The Portkeys really shines here as it's by far the smallest and slimmest out of the 3. There are 0 bezels, and the plastic casing around the display is basically as thin as it possibly can be. Because I want a very lightweight monitor, weight is obviously fairly important. And the Portkeys really leads the charge here. It's only 170 grams and feels incredibly light. The Osee is just 5 grams heavier, and it's very hard to tell the difference between them. The Shinobi, on the other hand, comes in a bit heavier at 200 grams. That's 30 grams heavier than the Portkeys. Holding it on its own, it does feel quite lightweight, but when compared to the Portkeys, you can definitely tell a difference. It's a bit chunky. The Shinobi and Portkeys both feel very well put together. They're still plastic, but they feel solid and well made. I would say the Shinobi feels more premium though. The plastic seems a little higher quality. The Osee, on the other hand, does feel kind of cheap and flimsy. It's definitely not the worst thing out there, but it does feel cheaper than the other 2. It's more hollow, and the LCD panel feels plasticky almost, especially in comparison to the Shinobi, which has a very robust screen. It feels like the screen on a smartphone, whereas the Osee screen kind of feels more like an old MP3 player. One thing I find super handy on monitors is a locating pinhole next to the mounting thread. That way, if you're using something like this Smallrig friction mount, you don't have to worry about the monitor coming loose. This little locating pin will hold the monitor in place and prevent it from twisting or coming loose. The Osee and Portkeys both have these little holes, with the Portkeys actually having a really smart design. Instead of holes, it actually has a small trough to accommodate friction mounts with different pin placements. Unfortunately, the Shinobi does not have this, which is kind of weird because the Ninja V does have locating holes, and the 2 monitors have almost the exact same design. I definitely did not expect to talk about power buttons when I started making this review, but the difference between the Shinobi and the other 2 monitors is very noticeable. The Osee and Portkeys monitors both have on-off switches, whereas the Shinobi has a push and hold button. Turning on the monitors is basically the same, it's turning them off where the differences come in. With the Shinobi, you have to hold the power button for a full 4 seconds to get it to turn off. On the other 2, all you have to do is flip a switch. You wouldn't think holding a button for 4 seconds is that bad, but it is surprisingly annoying. The speed at which the monitors power on isn't a deal breaker by any means, but it is nice to have something that powers on quickly, especially if you turn off your monitor regularly to save battery life. The Osee and Shinobi were really close with 14 and 15 second startup times respectively, but the Portkeys blew them both out of the water with a startup time of only 10 seconds. Brightness is a fairly important aspect for me because of the vast amount of scenarios I film in. Half the time I'm outside in bright sunlight, so I need to make sure my monitor will still be viewable. Now when I ordered these, I knew the Portkeys was only 600 nits, while the other 2 were 1000. but I wanted to test out the Portkeys just in case 600 might work. Turns out it does not. It's very hard to see this screen when standing outside in direct sunlight. If I was only going to be using this inside, it'd probably be fine. But for wedding filmmaking, it just doesn't cut it in the brightness department. The Shinobi and Osee are both rated for 1000 nits, although when comparing them side by side, the Shinobi actually looks brighter to me. Not really sure what that's about. They both perform really well outside in the sun though. The Osee is a little harder to see outside, but I think that mostly comes down to a different issue that I'll get to later. When I was ordering these monitors, I totally thought that 1000 nits would be plenty of brightness. But after using these a bit in direct sun, I do think it would be nice to have something even brighter. I found a few 5-inch monitors that do offer more than 1000 nits of brightness, but all of them were well over 200 grams, and I'd rather have a lighter monitor than a brighter one, at least at this point. The SmallHD Action 5 does look pretty interesting though. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, it's very important to me that the monitor I choose closely matches the colors and contrast of the C70's LCD screen. To test this, I literally just held each monitor next to the C70 and tried to see if I could notice any differences. Sadly, the Osee is the worst performer here, and I think the thing that really hurt it for me was the viewing angle. If you're looking directly at the display and shift it even like 10 degrees off axis, the screen starts to get really washed out. I found this super annoying when I was shooting with it because I was always having to adjust the angle of the monitor to be able to see the image properly. The quality of the screen is also lacking. It just feels like a cheaper product. The contrast does match the C70 pretty well though, and the colors are off, but they're not terrible. The Portkeys appears to have the fewest flaws here. It has great contrast that is very similar to the C70's LCD, although you do need to toggle on the black levels option in the menu, otherwise there's not quite enough contrast. The color is a little bit cooler than the C70's LCD, but it's really not that big of a difference. It's very close. And the viewing angles are great. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I'm not completely satisfied with the Portkeys screen. Like I said, it has the fewest flaws, but it's not perfect. I think it may just be that the screen isn't bright enough, but I'm not certain. I just feel like I want a little bit more out of it. The Shinobi is kind of the opposite of the Portkeys. It has really sharp details, everything is very clear and easy to see, and the color rendering is really good. The problem is that the white balance of the monitor, at least my particular monitor, is a little bit off. It's too warm. Luckily though, you do have the option to calibrate the display using a display calibration tool and Atomos's horrendously overpriced connector cable, which is nice, but it's also very frustrating that you have to pay extra money for it. And unfortunately, the white balance problem seems to be a fairly common issue on Atomos monitors. I've seen quite a few people say that their Shinobi or Ninja V has a really warm cast to it. It does appear that not every monitor has this issue though, so you may receive yours in the mail and it's completely fine. There's also an option to send your monitor off to Atomos and they can calibrate it for you, which is nice if you don't already have or don't want to spend the money on a display calibrator tool. But let's move on from the Shinobi's white balance issue and get to an even bigger issue, the contrast. This is a very crunchy monitor. When you apply a LUT to a log image, it just doesn't quite work right. The highlights and blacks become very crushed. Details in the shadows that I can see just fine on my C70's LCD screen are completely obliterated in the Shinobi. I've also tested this on the Ninja V and it's the same story. If anyone knows of a fix for this, please let me know. Luckily the monitor is still usable though, because it only seems to affect the really bright highlights and the really dark shadows. And I don't necessarily need to see those details when I'm just previewing my image anyway. Still annoying though, and something Atomos really needs to address, especially with this being a $300 monitor and the Ninja V being $600. All of these monitors are set when it comes to video assist tools. There's a huge collection to choose from, and they appear to all basically have the same tools available. Here's a quick list of the main ones. LUT support, false color, zebras, waveform, peaking, vector scope, histogram, zoom, anamorphic D-squeeze. Strangely, the Shinobi does not have an option for a thirds grid, but the other two do. Now, even with all of these options available, I don't care. The C70 already has all the assist tools I need built into the camera. So whenever I toggle on false color, for example, it'll show up on the camera's LCD, but also on my monitor. Because I'll really only be using this monitor when it's attached to the camera, I can completely rely on the C70's assist tools. The one assist tool that the C70 does not give me though is external LUT support. But luckily all three of these monitors do allow you to load your own LUTs onto them. Like I mentioned earlier though, Atomos monitors seem to have some issue with LUTs. The highlights and blacks are really crushed, so just be aware of that. I also ran into a weird issue when loading LUTs onto the Osee. The instruction manual that comes with the monitor tells you to format the SD card to FAT32. However, that does not work. You instead have to format the card to just FAT to be able to load your LUTs. Very weird and very annoying. There are a few special features included in these monitors that I wanted to touch on. The Portkeys has two features that the Osee and Shinobi are lacking. The first is pinch to zoom. With the PT6, all you have to do to zoom in on your image is this. Super handy and very frustrating that the Shinobi doesn't support this. It's a touch screen. It should support it. The Portkeys also has an HDMI out port, meaning you can actually send out the camera signal from the monitor and attach a second monitor or recorder if you wanted to. The Osee has a really handy auto flip setting that pairs super well with the yoke mount that comes with it. The Shinobi has a really cool assist tool that I don't think the other two have. It allows you to solo the blue channel, which is where the majority of low light noise lives, so you can very easily see how much noise you have in your image. Pretty cool. To wrap things up, let me give you my brief pros and cons for each monitor. I think that the Portkeys PT6 is probably my favorite monitor out of these three. It's incredibly thin, low profile, and lightweight, which I love. The touchscreen works well, and I love that it has pinch to zoom. The screen quality isn't as nice as the Shinobi, it's a little bit softer, but for the money, it's totally acceptable. Plus, the contrast matches the C70's LCD super well. I feel like I'm really able to see all the dynamic range the camera is giving me. Sadly though, the brightness just isn't there. It's very hard to see outside, which basically takes it off the table for me, unfortunately. Goodbye. However, if Portkeys ever makes a 1000 nit version of this monitor, I would pick it up immediately. 100%. The Osee definitely feels like the budget option here. Everything about it just feels a bit cheaper, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I do think that this is a good monitor. It's got tons of assist tools and it goes up to 1000 nits, which is pretty impressive. The thing I just couldn't get past was the viewing angle. It always felt like the screen was washed out and I kept having to adjust it in order to see the correct contrast ratio. I have seen a ton of reviews for it on YouTube and people do love this thing. I guess it's just not for me. Back to Amazon. And that brings us to the Shinobi, the most frustrating monitor I've ever used. It's the most expensive monitor in this budget monitor category, and it's somehow the least feature-rich. What's that about? There's no thirds grid, there's no pinch to zoom even though it's a touchscreen, there's no secondary power option like a DC barrel jack, there's no locating hole next to the mounting thread, and the LUTs
don't even work correctly.
It's also the largest monitor out of the three and it weighs the most. And yet, this is the monitor I will be keeping. The other monitors just so happen to have issues that I simply can't get past, which kind of leaves this as the last monitor standing. That being said though, the screen quality is superb. It's very sharp and the color rendering is great even though the white balance is off. The viewing angle is excellent. I never have to worry about the image washing out if I'm viewing it off axis. It also appears to be the brightest of the three and performs really well outside in the sun. As annoying as the LUT issue is, I can work around it. From my experience so far, it doesn't appear to be negatively impacting my ability to expose my images correctly. So I guess it's fine. So yeah, I'll be hanging on to the Shinobi. If Portkeys ever releases a 1000 nit version of the PT6, I will definitely be jumping ship. I really do love that monitor. And if anyone knows of another monitor I should also consider, please let me know. I'm happy to try out other options as well. Small HD Action 5 maybe? Okay, I'm recording now. I can't tell if it's peaking because I'm looking at the screen through a mirror. I gotta get so excited! Ah!
I really hope you're recording right now.
Woo! Woo! I may have dropped it. It's okay though, it's one of the ones I'm returning. I need another C70 so I can have it as a prop. I want to like throw it, but I need to return it.